Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the IBME UBU show. I'm your host, Antoine Valentin, and today we're joined by our guest, Don MacLennan. Don MacLennan is the Chief Product Officer at LastPass. LastPass manages your passwords in online life so you don't have to. Throughout his career, Don has held several product leadership roles at notable enterprise organizations, including SAP, RSA, Barracuda, and McAfee. Don also was the co-founder and CEO of Blue Nose Analytics. Blue Nose Analytics was a SaaS solution for online businesses to drive product adoption and increase subscriber retention. Don earned a bachelor's in economics from Acadia University. All right, welcome. Today I'm talking to Don MacLennan, currently you're leading at LastPass, and I know that you and I met several years ago, and you've had several roles since then. Do you want to just give a brief overview of yourself and sort of what you're currently doing and what the company's all about?
Yeah, sure. So glad to have this opportunity to chat with you today. I'm the Chief Product Officer at a company called LastPass. And for both consumers and businesses, we help them generate, store, retrieve, and use complex, tamper-resistant passwords, right? We all have so many online accounts these days. And it's kind of a hassle, right, to try to remember them ourselves. That biases us towards using ones that are too simple. So using a password manager is a great capability that protects you against account loss, account compromise, and the like. We do some other things for businesses we don't do for consumers in terms of fancier features, but that's kind of the core of the business. I've been here about 2 months.
Right. I saw that on your LinkedIn profile, but I know historically you've traditionally worked a lot in product and engineering, et cetera. Would you say that's sort of like your passion in life, at least professionally?
Yeah, 100%. About 14 years into my career, I had been in all sorts of go-to-market and field roles. I started my career as an enterprise software sales rep. I also did some things in around sales management, channels, business development, alliances, and around the 14-year mark, I made a pivot. I was working for a small startup. I was in the sales organization. Like many of the salespeople around me, this was 2001, which was also known as nuclear winter for trying to sell enterprise business apps. I was struggling, but the CEO of the company had spotted in me a certain capability of taking the product's features and figuring out how to relate them to the needs of an industry. And he's like, gosh, we need that capability in our marketing organization. The marketing leader was a vacancy. He said, would you be interested to do that instead? And, my ego was a little bruised because I still fancied myself as a capable salesperson. I had had very significant success in my past as a sales rep, but I slept on it because I knew in my heart of hearts that I was not going to be in sales for the rest of my career. And so I came back a little later in the week and I said, Kent, I'm up for it. And so I took over the marketing function for the startup. And then very soon after that, product management. That would have been around 2002. And since 2002, product management has been an ingredient in every job I've had since.
Interesting. So, I find that fascinating because personally, I'm a big fan of following, sort of identifying your strengths, playing to your strengths, increasing the likelihood of your success. And so I'm wondering, when you talked about sales and you did well at it, and it sounds like you were enjoying it. It sounds like the market and the economy at that time maybe was difficult for everyone, regardless.
It was.
But then you were given this opportunity. Do you think that was sort of, the universe sort of aligning itself for you, or it was like kind of giving you an opportunity to maybe pursue something that was, 100%. Even though you were good at sales, maybe better aligned against your strengths and your interests?
Oh yeah, 100%. I think I knew in my heart of hearts for years up until that point that I needed to make a move. In other words, I'd proven to myself I could be successful in sales, but my heart wasn't in it. It's a role in which you got to be really committed and really passionate. Right? And so I knew that I wasn't as committed or as passionate about it anymore as maybe I once had been. And so just getting tapped on the shoulder in that way at that moment in time did me a great service in retrospect. Maybe I could even argue it was a few years overdue, but I'm very thankful for the opportunity for having pivoted.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I always like to look at things through the leadership lens. Now I'm wondering how many years have gone by and how many individuals have worked for you that maybe you've done that for? Has there been people that you've worked with where you said, you know what, I'm thinking based on what you know about them that they might be better elsewhere, and maybe you had a similar conversation that your CEO had with you? Did anything like that happen?
Oh, 100%. Like you, I'm a big subscriber to that kind of strengths-based framework. My belief is everybody has some form of inner talent, inner genius. And so often in the workplace, right, they're being asked to play a role where it doesn't perfectly align to that. And so there's been multiple occasions in my leadership career wherein I looked at somebody and said, gosh, I really think they're great at this, except in the role they're currently playing, maybe that's not really their day job. And I've moved some people out of roles into very different roles, all within the realm of a technology company, but still something that to them felt really disruptive. Only for them to find out a few months or a couple of years later that, yeah, that was a good move for them. Sometimes I've done it more on the margin, in other words, changed something about their role and responsibility, but just enough that they were better suited to doing that than where they started.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like from what you're saying, again, for you personally, it worked out. And would you say more often than not, when you did that for someone on your team, it worked out as well?
Yeah. More often than not, it has. I think as a leader, right, obviously you need to be pretty good at spotting people's strengths and then finding an empathetic way to have that conversation, build that trust, build that rapport in order to be able to give that kind of feedback. It's not always welcome, right? People may have a self-perception that's different than how you see them, and maybe their self-perception is not as accurate as a result. And so, there's something about navigating that conversation that's really, really important. But more often than not, it's work. For that.
So, yeah, there's a perfect opportunity. I wanted to segue a little bit and just talk about your leadership style and what it is currently, and then contrast that to maybe if you can think back to the beginning of your leadership journey, how it was then, and what are the things that sort of happened along the way that caused you change. And so let's just start with, where are you now? Like if you were to define your leadership style after many years of experience, how do you see it?
I think that I have come to seeing leadership as being a little simpler than maybe I once imagined. In other words, set a clear direction, keep it simple enough for people to understand the way in which their work relates to it, right? And then just stick with it. Stick with it for a long time. You don't have to be great at everything to be a great company. You have to be great at something, and trying to be okay at everything, in my experience, has not usually led to outsized success. So I've gotten much more comfortable with making a small number of big bets, because in some respects, I don't worry about the bet anymore. I worry about the focus and the sustained effort against that investment. And I've come to believe that's what really in the end pays off. And I've seen it a couple times where I've been given the opportunity to sort of work on a couple things and really move the needle. And by that, I mean, it took a couple years of concerted effort, not a quarter or a week. I've seen the payback. So I'm kind of become a believer in that. And everything gets a little simpler, to be honest, in terms of, one's leadership role, or you start paying attention to other things, which is, gosh, do I have the right team on the field, as opposed to, am I controlling the work and managing the processes and trying to keep all these balls in the air, right? When keeping all those balls in the air in the end may not actually be very effective.
Right. And I heard you mention having a vision. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of vision and how you've been able to create a vision in the past with the organizations and the teams you've led and used it effectively?
To be honest, I don't know that I would call myself a visionary product leader. I don't fancy myself as one. Maybe somebody else thinks of me that way. But I do believe on focusing on a small number of things and doing them exceptionally well. They're almost always easily discovered by your customers. Like, why did your customer hire you? It's almost always one or two things in terms of what source of value they're expecting from your product. If you get to 5, I'd be shocked. I'll give you an example. Like in my immediately prior company, I was working at Barracuda Networks. One of our flagship products was an anti-phishing solution. So about 95% of all successful cybersecurity attacks begin with the bad guy, the bad actor, right, sending emails into the target organization, trying to trick employees into doing something, whether it's download a file or click on a link or send money, whatever it is. So if you can do a really good job at blocking phishing attacks, then all those downstream things that could go wrong are moot, right? And so we had an anti-phishing solution. Guess why customers hired us? To be accurate at it, right? To detect them all. It was so simple at some level. all these other features around how you might configure the product, would it be important to some customers some of the time? But in the end, like the one thing we got hired for is product efficacy, right?
Mhm.
Accurate determination of whether or not it was a fish, and if it was a fish, block it from being delivered as an email. Simple. Now, doing that really well, very complicated, but that's all we focused on for years, and we really moved the needle. Meaning
Yeah.
we got much better at it.
Right. You reminded me of a whole bunch of questions I want to ask you about product and how it affects customer success. Of course, when you and I met, I was working as VP of Customer Success for an organization, and you were actually leading your own customer success platform organization. We can talk about that in a minute, but let's continue as far as the leadership in your evolution. You shared some thoughts regarding where you're at now. Can you think back to the beginning of your leadership journey and how you saw leadership, maybe leading into or starting your first leadership role?
Yeah. Gosh, this is painful because what I now know is that I was a very insecure leader. And I think from that insecurity of being like a little earlier in my career and not really knowing, how to do it well, that insecurity manifested in control, right? Whether it was micromanagement or implementing processes that were controlling by their nature, that afforded me like a lot of visibility into what was happening or involved me by necessity, right? And over time, I've sort of outgrown that insecurity. I've relinquished that control. I focus much more about, hey, did I hire somebody who's intrinsically motivated? Do they have the right talent? Am I empowering them? Another way to think about it is I've sort of started to subscribe to that notion of the servant leader, right? My role exists to enable other people's success. And that also means not getting in the way.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you there as far as the change based in the perception originally or in the beginning of the leadership journey, and then learning. I know that definitely there was some real life examples I lived through that sort of forced a lot of change, and some of them were quite painful, but necessary ultimately to get me to evolve. But it's a journey, right? I mean, you talk about servant leadership. I've used the term myself in the past, and I'm just curious. If I'll share with you my thoughts on it and tell me if you agree or disagree. So I would say the servant leadership, yes, agree with you there. Let's again be there to support our team, accomplish the goals, as opposed to sort of the other way around. And I associate that with the power dynamic where you have authority, but you don't necessarily use it, let's say. Versus the opposite end of the spectrum is maybe a more authoritative leader who uses their power and try to get things done, so to speak. So I used to think it was kind of like an either or thing, but recently, I had some discussions with different people that said that maybe while I agree, servant leadership is the better way to go, there are times, in fact, when you have to sort of use your authority or your power in certain situations. And, would you agree? And if so, maybe just elaborate that on a bit and how to do that.
Yeah. Yep.
In a good
I
way.
would.
You don't.
Yeah. Yep. I think the ultimate use of my authority is deciding the highest level priorities. And so, I might be inclusive in terms of saying, okay, team, what do we think our top priorities are? What are the 3 things we're going to die on the hill for? And eventually, right, it's my decision to decide what those 3 things are, and as importantly, what the other things aren't. And that is for sure using my authority, right? That decision is very, very consequential. What I've found is as long as you're inclusive in terms of taking the inputs, right, whether it's from your own team or from the market or your customers, landing on those is not so controversial. I mean, people expect leaders to take decisions. And but that clarity usually unlocks people, right, and de-stresses the situation for them. So I think that as it relates to use of authority, a good use of authority is taking that call, right? What are our top 3 priorities and being very clear about it, very decisive about it. That puts people in a position to execute. And once they're in that execution mode, maybe that's where the servant leadership paradigm kicks in, right? Because you're there to enable them to execute against something that's already been decided.
You just reminded me of a recent interview I heard. Alex Friedman interviewed Jeff Bezos, and Jeff Bezos was talking about some of his leadership practices. And I've heard he said something I heard other leaders say, where he'll be the last person to speak in a leadership meeting. He'll wait for
Mhm.
everyone. And tell me if you've ever encountered this. So I get that, and it makes sense. But there's sometimes weird situations where people will kind of look to you and expect for you again to sort of chime in. And if you don't, they think you're either not doing your job or you're not interested or whatever. So have you ever experienced that? And if so, again, how do you strike that balance where you don't want to impose your opinions on your team? You want to give them an opportunity to speak up, but at the same time, you don't want to appear as if you're not interested or, again, not doing your job. So any thoughts on that?
It strikes me as a little situational, to be honest. I'm not sure that I have a standard approach to that. You're absolutely right. Like, I've been in those meetings, right, where people were happy to voice their opinions, and by speaking last, you kind of bring it all to a close, and then people understand your point of view and so forth. And I've been in other meetings where people are very unsure of themselves, and so they want some cues from you. I attribute it more to the personalities and maybe the culture, or maybe even how new in my tenure am I, than anything else. And that's why I kind of call it situational, because I don't have a pattern I tend to rely on in that case.
Yeah. In my case, what I've tried to do is sort of explain at least once or as often as necessary that I'm intentionally not saying anything. I certainly have opinions.
Right.
I don't want to influence you all. Please, have a go at it. And if if it gets stalled or you want me to step in sooner than later, I will. And I find that helps.
Yeah, agreed.
Talk to me about from an organizational standpoint, your thoughts on the leadership team and the need for alignment there as it affects the entire organization from a trickle-down perspective. Any thoughts on that as far as maybe how you've seen it work well or maybe not so well?
Yeah. It's interesting. Leadership teams have their own personalities as a collective. And I've been part of lots of leadership teams, and they all kind of feel like an individual, a different individual. I've been on some teams that were very, very non-confrontational, almost to the point where everybody had their own fiefdom. And as long as you didn't wander into somebody else's fiefdom, then harmony prevailed. And that wasn't so constructive, because there are times when, you've got to take decisions collectively about how to evolve the business, right? What to invest in, how to respond to market conditions. Just, the world in which we work is so dynamic. I've seen other teams where there was so much conflict that it was dysfunction, where people just couldn't even have a conversation. So I've seen the gamut. I happen to really like the leadership team I'm on right now, because it appears to be full of people who are pretty experienced and balanced and inclusive. I think in part because, LastPass went through a very high profile security incident in the recent past. And man, being in those trenches, going through that episode as a leadership team was very, very hard. I'm new to that party, but it also is the case that when I was at my prior company, Barracuda, we had something similar happen, and I was in that war room for weeks at a time. So this team looks as though they've gained a real bond, right, by working through adversity together, and I can kind of sense it, and that cohesion is very palpable. It's actually a very diverse team. I was thrilled to learn that 51 or 52% of all of our people leaders at director and above are women, and I love that facet of diversity, because I like diversity in every form, but inclusive along the gender spectrum, because it just is a different point of view. It's a different perspective. Every conversation is better for it in terms of decision making and just the context. And so I really like the team I'm on.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's wonderful. And just curious, when it comes to scale, you've worked for obviously some early stage startups, including your own, and then also some very large organizations. How have you been able to navigate those waters as far as transitioning, from larger to smaller? And any advice there around how to make that adjustment?
Yeah, I think that's been, for me, an interesting challenge. And one of the things I've learned about my own self when it comes to motivation is I like a puzzle. I like a challenge. I like the idea of decoding something, of figuring it out. And so I've often applied that to oh, well, how would I adapt myself to be part of a startup? As you mentioned, I co-founded a startup, so that's as small as it gets. And conversely, I helped build a company that got sold to SAP, and I spent a year and a half at SAP. I think that's probably the largest company I've ever worked with, and that was something like 35,000 people at the time. So to me, kind of figuring out how to adapt and thinking about that as an interesting challenge, right, was helpful. But I also have observed, some people do better in a certain size of company than others. It strikes me that uncertainty versus certainty, ambiguity versus clarity, risk versus not risk, like these are aspects of how people prosper in some companies and not others. Some people really struggle with a startup because the certainty of income might be really important to them, either because of who they are as a personality, or maybe even they're just family and lifestyle needs, in which case they can't imagine going without a paycheck for a couple of months, in which case that's a real prospect in a startup that's between venture rounds, for example. And vice versa. I've seen people with like an incredibly creative and entrepreneurial mindset, and they might struggle with a mature company, right, that doesn't move so quickly or at all.
So one last question I wanted to ask you about organizational health, and as it relates to development of talent. And we talked about people transitioning roles and growing within an organization. How much responsibility do you think an organization should have as far as developing their talent versus the individual taking ownership of that on their own, in order to sort of advance their careers?
Yeah, great question. I like to tell my people, you're the CEO of your career. So the definition of where you are and where you want to be is entirely on you, right? It's not your boss's job to chart a career course for you. Only you can determine that and communicate it. The company then becomes the enabler, right, to the best of its ability. And that's where it does vary. Probably the greatest experience in professional development I ever had was at EMC Corporation. If you remember, that was a storage technology company, now part of Dell. And then I worked inside a division of EMC called RSA Security. So that was like the cybersecurity product group. And I always remember, because I was quite a bit earlier in my leadership career, I always remember that they had this thing called EMC University. And it was literally a curriculum of courses that you could attend in person or online across everything: financial literacy, working across cultures, like you name it. It was this long list of things. And it predates a lot of the learning platforms that we now have access to, because this would have been, the better part of 15, 20 years ago. I thought, oh my gosh, isn't this amazing? I could be a student for free. And the quality of the content was great. That's the extreme. I've never seen a company invest so much in workforce development as they did. And I really enjoyed taking advantage of it. Fast forward to today, there's a lot of tools and choices out there. We don't even necessarily need our company to do something for us, because these learning platforms exist whether they're coming through the company or not. And so, I don't think about, is a curriculum accessible to an employee? I think instead about, how do I help them come up with a plan and guide them towards, whatever outcome they're looking for. But also it's the case that a lot of learning is experiential. So yes, you can say there's courses from a learning and development point of view, and employers can play a role in that. But a lot of learning is experiential. It's on the job, right? How do I expose somebody to a new challenge and give them the opportunity to learn from it? That's where you can't replicate that with traditional learning and development, curricula.
Yeah, I'm with you there. And I mean, I think if I could summarize it, it's sort of a joint effort in where the individual has to meet you at least halfway. Meaning, if you distinguish yourself and you have a desire to learn and to grow and to become more, then there's a path for you where we can work together, and it's sort of a win-win. So let's touch upon a slightly different subject again, but you reminded me of it earlier with something that you said. Again, as a product leader, I love to ask you this type of question. Again, I've historically worked primarily in customer success function, and customer success teams are typically measured on retention, CSAT. Now, I agree, customer success teams have a huge impact on that, but I've always argued the number one reason for churn is typically product-related issues.
Yes, it is.
And you're nodding, so I'm glad you agree. But do you want to expand on that a bit as far as why do you think that is? And furthermore, why do you think it is that, at least in my experience, I don't often get people that agree with me in that sense, and they seem to think sort of the buck starts and stops with customer success?
Oh, interesting. No, I don't agree with that at all. I'm with you. I think the product has got a lot to do with it. One of the things that I was talking earlier about how my leadership style has evolved, and I keep on trying to make it simpler and simpler, right? Both for how I think about my day job, but also how do I engage with others. So one of the ways where my thinking has evolved to get even simpler is just basic concept of value attainment, right? In other words, if a customer attains value, they're going to renew, and if they don't, they won't. And I've even gone further in saying, well, maybe we should just start with defining what first value looks like. Can we do that? Can we measure that? And so I've gone through that exercise. This will be my third company in a row where I've done that. So value attainment, imagine you have a data backup product. Well, what would be the moment of first value? When you completed your first backup. Everything before that is your onboarding journey, in which case, you can inspect all the friction and the need for help and training and certification and the like. But in the end, if the product makes it easy in terms of getting to that value milestone, right, things tend to go well. In fact, I've had kind of, a passion for analytics. That's been another pretty common ingredient in a lot of the jobs I've done in the last 15 years. I've been able to prove kind of mathematically that value attainment causes retention, especially early value attainment. So if you get a customer through that moment of first value, and they do so within minutes, hours, and days of becoming a customer, as opposed to weeks and months, the outcome is statistically far better from a retention point of view.
Yeah.
So I am now in the habit of holding my product team accountable for value attainment as a North Star metric, even though customer success thinks that way already. So it just makes for a very easy partnership between me and my chief customer officer, because we now agree the same metric applies to us equally.
Yeah.
But to the product team, it's maybe a little newer or maybe a little narrower, right? Because they're thinking about, gosh, the more features I can put out there, the better my product is. Maybe yes, but maybe no.
Right.
If you can't get the first value, everything else is moot. And the next feature you build's got nothing to do with nothing.
Right. I'm so glad you agree. And then there is, I think, one of the most valuable things I know that I personally try as a CS leader to provide my partners on product teams is that frontline information, acting as the voice of the customer, sharing feedback, not necessarily a long list of feature requests, but what's the positive and the negative feedback we're hearing about what's available right now. And would you agree that's a crucial component of a healthy relationship between customer success and product teams?
100%. Yep. One of the ways I hold product managers accountable is, how many listening posts have you created that you use, right, to drive your decision making in terms of product prioritization? And one of the most important listening posts is the organization that talks to the customer every day. So as and when there's a customer success organization, that's obviously a first-class listening post, right, to go get that feedback from. Customer support can be another. Sales can be another. If you're in a consumer business, you have none of those actors, in which case you're reliant on other measures, right, satisfaction surveys and product telemetry and the like. But I think every product team does better when they have these important listening posts established, and it's informing how they take prioritization decisions. The other aspect of it is those listening posts, especially coming from customer success, and we're talking about value. Sometimes what it informs is that you have a feature in the market, but you need to rework it because it's not working for the customer yet, which is a different mindset than saying I need a net new feature. Sometimes the roadmap is better comprised of reworking things so that they deliver on the promise, because they're not done yet.
Right.
There's a lot of 1.0 features out there in the world in products that actually needed to become 2.0 to fulfill the customer need.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad you agree. And again, my hope is that customer success leaders are working alongside their product leaders and ensuring there's that alignment and that flow of information. What's your biggest takeaway from your experience at Blue Nose? Again, correct me if I'm wrong. I think that was your first or maybe one of your only CEO roles.
That's right. Yep.
Well, and obviously that's a wonderful accomplishment to have your own organization. What would you say was your biggest sort of takeaway from that experience?
Well, it was a spectacular failure, and failure is the best teacher. So, it's probably one of the best learning experiences I've ever had in my career. It just, the pressure of a startup, confronting failure. And by the way, most startups fail slowly, not quickly, right? Which was the case, and, kind of hung on there for a couple of years past the time when it was clear it was unlikely to work out. It was humbling, to be sure. And I think I learned a lot about myself as a leader. I certainly learned a lot about product market fit. And in retrospect, I think what I came to understand is that I really wanted the answer to be yes, that this startup could succeed because of the state of the customer's need and ability to work with us. And in reality, I was really denying the ground truth, which was the customers were not generally ready to use these technologies. So much about customer success automation as a product category is predicated on bringing data into it.
Right.
That drives the workflow. The data would be, okay, what's my definitive list of customers? What's their subscription amount? When does it expire? Are they using the product, and by what measure? And when you bring all that data together and it's accurate, it's transformative in terms of the customer success team knowing exactly who they need to talk to and why and when, right? So it's a very powerful value prop. The practical reality is, at least at the time, most customers of my product didn't have their data in a state where it was accurate enough to be relied upon in this way. And so I kept looking past that, that sort of what's the phrase? Inconvenient truth, right? I kept looking past it. And the reality is I shouldn't have, because in the end, amongst many other things that, didn't go right or I didn't do well, that was probably the most important factor in terms of whether or not we were able to succeed.
Yeah. Well, for what it's worth, from where I'm standing, I think just a tremendous accomplishment that you went for it. You went from, working for other organizations, starting your own. That's a huge accomplishment in and of itself. And then secondly, I think the important learning for me, and again, anyone else that will listen to this, is that while it didn't work out, it was still a learning opportunity. And that is a positive thing.
Oh, yeah.
Yet the reality is, again, we learn from mistakes, and that it's okay to try and fail as long as we, again, pick ourselves up, learn from that, and we take what we learn and we apply it to the future. And it looks like you've certainly done that in roles that you've been at since then. A couple of last questions. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Don.
Yeah, I want to stay on that topic for a second. Up until that point, I kind of said it earlier, right? I think I was, as a leader, somewhat more insecure than I am today. Why are we insecure? Well, because we feel failure. We fear failure. And most importantly, we fear the consequences of failure. Like, oh my God, what happens if I mess up? Is my career over? Am I going to get fired? Am I going to lose my house? And, all this catastrophizing, and so actually failing, losing $13 million of investors' money and all the worries about what would happen, in retrospect, it did not tank my career. I'll never be able to measure what the difference between failure and success was like. But to be honest, I've had a really good career since, and I've been very fortunate. And I think part of the way in which I've been able to evolve my leadership style is I don't fear failure as much. I obviously don't want to fail, but I don't fear it to the point where I'm as controlling as I might have been in the past. I'm probably a more empathetic leader for having had that failure.
Yeah. Yeah. And if I understand your last comment about being an empathetic leader, my assumption is you're probably a lot more forgiving when someone on your team takes a chance and fails.
Yes, exactly right.
As long as they learn from it. And take
exactly. That's
right?
the only duty you have, right, is to learn, and because failure is a given.
Yeah. And taking ownership of that and committing yourself to learning. Agreed. There's a couple of last questions I wanted to ask you because I'm just curious. And again, I want to be respectful of your time. I know you're busy, and I appreciate you carving out some time for me today. We all lived through this COVID pandemic. I'm just wondering, with having to work from home, maybe that was something you already did before, or you managed teams that were remote. How, if at all, did you have to evolve your leadership style faced with that reality that we all lived through?
Yep. Yeah. It changed me as a leader for sure, or it caused me to use some of these more recent empathetic tools to a much greater extent. So let me give you an example. In March of 2020, I think that was the time when companies really started shutting down their offices and sending people home on very short notice, like a couple days notice. So that was the case in my company at Barracuda. And so I said, oh my gosh, like, let me just get everybody on a Zoom call on a Monday morning for 15 minutes and just check in with them, right? Just to remind ourselves, we're still on a team. It's a forum in which people can ask questions because the uncertainty at the time was crazy, right? We had no idea what was going on with the pandemic, when we go back to work, all the things. And so I started hosting a 15-minute all hands meeting every Monday morning at whatever, 8 o'clock or something. And I never stopped. And the content of that, I'm still doing it after I left 3.5 years later. And the content of the meeting was really simple. I had 2 or 3 slides, and I showed them virtually every week for years on end. The first slide was a picture of like all those oxygen masks that fall from the airplane, right? They deploy when the pressure drops, right? Yeah. And so the title of the slide was, "Put your own mask on before helping others."
All right, yeah.
And the message I would say is, hey, your own well-being is first and foremost, because you can't be a great partner, spouse, friend, coworker, any of these things, right, if you're not in a state of well-being. And given the times and the stress and the uncertainty, right, don't take it for granted, right? Be intentional about investing in your own well-being. And the next slide I had was about this list of 10 priorities, and it all had just them, numeral 1 through 10, priority 1, priority 2, and then I had a dotted red lines for like between priority 5 and 6. And I said, every single week, formalize what it is you're going to work on this week and make sure you draw the line. The most important thing you do is draw the line and tell your boss where the line is. In other words, say no to the things you're not going to get to so that you don't have to worry about them all week. Like, de-stress yourself, right? And by showing it to your boss, you're getting his or her agreement that these are your priorities. And yeah, you're not going to get to something. So much stress is about the work we don't get done. And, as a backlog, because it's infinite. Mm-hmm. So I showed those 2 slides almost every week for years on end. Mm-hmm. And I had people tell me, gosh, it's really great every week to be reminded of those things. Well, they could have written the slide down for themselves. They knew exactly what I was going to say. So, what I took from that was just leading with a people first message, exhibiting empathy, really trying to recognize where they were at in their world because it had been turned upside down. The positive feedback I got from hosting that meeting really kind of shocked me, because I at one point thought, well, gosh, they've heard this all before. This is kind of a stupid meeting. It's like a kind of trivial. And that wasn't the case. They'd come to rely on it.
That's great. That's great. So last question, any, advice you would give for first-time leaders or any leaders that are looking to sort of grow that they could take away from you?
Get a mentor.
Get a mentor.
Yeah. Somebody outside the company who's got that objectivity that comes with distance, who's got, maybe a few years or more. I have a mentor right now who is 75 years old and is still active. He sits on boards. He's doing cause-based work for things he believes in. He's teaching himself how to program in JavaScript so he can update his website. Like, what an inspiring guy, right? He's so intellectually engaged, but at 75 years old, given what he accomplished in his career, it's just like infinite wisdom for me. So, to this day, I rely on mentor relationships, and I think they're incredibly important, because that's the one person who's always in your corner. And if you find the right person, you can trust them and be very vulnerable with them in a way that's very hard to be with other people, perhaps even your partner.
Sure.
And so I think that's just invaluable. I know it sounds so obvious because we've talked about mentors for decades now, and yet, I think without it, very, very hard to be a great leader. You need that support.
Agree with you 100% there. Don, this has been really wonderful. I've really enjoyed hearing your thoughts on these subjects we've discussed today. How should people get a hold of you, learn more about you or your organization going forward? I want to add those links in the comment section below.
Yeah, sure. You can hit me up on LinkedIn and message me there. You can go to my blog, and my email address is in the About Me section. You can find it there. My blog is www.donmaclennan.com. So my first name and last name is my domain. And so there's a couple of ways to get a hold of me and also read what I've written about. I work for LastPass, so it's lastpass.com in case you're interested in our products.
Fantastic. Don, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Antoine.